Hey, I had a little different setup tonight because I wanted to do a couple of videos tonight. I went outside and about wrapped my back up, so I'm sitting in the chair. So
follow the drinking gourd.
Let me go find a pillow while you're listening to this. Don't go
drinking gourd, for the old man's a waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow
You're going to use a dog bed.
the drinking gourd.
Wow.
For the old man's a waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow
That's
the
cool,
drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man's a waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.
Okay, I bet you can guess what our topic's gonna be about today. It's not quite as comical as the ones have been. It's a little more serious. I'm making this video. I'm saying it's for kids, but it's not really. Who followed the drinking gourd? The drinking gourd was a symbol of the North Star, the whole constellation. And the slaves trying to get freedom followed the drinking gourd. And I mean, a lot of you know about the underground railroad system. Well, it's not a railroad that goes underground like some of the fifth graders thought. But the underground railroad system was just a way for slaves to get to freedom. It didn't have to be what you think of, where you went from one house to the other, someone hid you, then you finally got to Indiana or Pennsylvania or wherever. Many slaves thought up their own ways to go. That's still considered being part of the Underground Railroad. And there's a few really unusual ones. The most famous ones that you've heard about, well, you maybe haven't heard about them, but they're there. Husband and wife slave did not work on the same plantation. Their name was William and Ellen Craft. She was a lot lighter skinned than what he was, so they decided to go as a white man with his slave, and she had to be the white man because of her lighter skin. So someday I'll do a whole story on it. She dressed up. She didn't know how to read or write, so they put a big thing on her arm, and her husband was her slave. Sometime we'll do a story on that, but we're going to do a story today on another one. And the best way to tell you about Henry Brown is to read the amazing book that they call it a children's book, but I just have a problem with that. It won the Caldecott Award, and there's a cover of it, and it's called Henry's Freedom Box. And so I'm going to read that to all of you, and then we'll talk about it at the end about, this is not a made-up story. It's true. It's just some author took it, got the absolute best illustrator in the world, and wrote this story. Ellen Levine and Kadar Nelson. And I think one of them probably did the pictures too, because they're just simply unreal. Well, I'll tell you more about it at the end, okay? Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave. And slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. One of my favorite pictures in the entire book. Now, I may have to stand up to make sure I'm getting it all in there. That's Henry. Is that gorgeous? The whole illustration. Can you imagine not even knowing when your birthday is? Most of us would not like that. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. And Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew that things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. So Mom was always talking to Henry about that. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother, and they climbed the wide staircase. And the master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. And he was very ill, and he beckoned for him to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners, and Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. So I'll show you the first picture of Henry standing beside his master. Okay, and then here's his mother with him. But the master said, "You're a good worker, Henry. I'm giving you to my son. I'm giving you to my son. You must obey him. You must never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry waved goodbye to his family. He looked across the field, and the leaves swirled in the wind. So there is Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy, and he poked him with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Oh, I have to stand up and make sure I'm showing these pages right and get that glare. There we go. See the stick? There's Henry looking at the stick. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and they talked and they agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves did not dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. So, and there, the two of them, Henry and Nancy, are walking and talking when they had a chance. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, they had to go check with their masters first. Henry and Nancy were married. And soon there was a little baby, and then another, and another. Henry knew that they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. And Henry sat very still. So here's that glare again. Sorry about that. There we go. There's Mom, Nancy, and her two kids. And here is Henry playing the guitar. Henry worked all morning, and he tried to forget what Nancy had said. I'll work on this. It's kind of a split page picture. And that shows Henry working and thinking about them coming to sell off his kids. Which is what had happened to him, right? His friend James came into the factory and he whispered something to Henry. "Your wife and your children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. Henry couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco!" The boss poked Henry. And Henry twisted his tobacco. And his heart twisted in his chest. So there they are, right after he finds out that his kids are being sold off. And his wife. And he can't leave work to do anything about it. A lot of people say, well, I'd just go. Well, then you'd be dead, and then what would that help? At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves was tied together, and the owner shouted at them. Henry looked everywhere for his family. Father! Father! Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? And he saw her at the same moment she saw him. And when he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. So here's Henry trying to see his kids, well, seeing his kids for the last time. And here are his kids shouting at their daddy. You one thing that this story is made up, but this story is not made up, and this happened all the time. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. And Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everybody that he loved. Henry knew that he would never see his family again. And there's Henry, almost every night. Work, dinner, bed. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? But how? He lifted a crate, and then he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day in an empty warehouse. Remember, he saw a crate. Henry arrived with a box. I'll show you Henry's box, and I'll finish the page. Hang on. There's his box. He's showing them. I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves, he said. James stared at the box and then at Henry. Well, what if you cough and someone hears you? I'll cover my mouth and I will hope, Henry said. I want to show you a picture of that. The good Dr. Smith looking too. He's studying the box, studying Henry. They're going to help him? Dr. Smith wrote on the box, to William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, this side up with care. So you can see the beginning up at the top of the address for Pennsylvania. You can see there the doctor writing up with care, this side up with care, and he's going to mail himself to him. Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. So he opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. No, cried James, no! Henry poured it on his hand, and it burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand, and they arranged to meet the next morning at 4 a.m. And then there he is with his friend after the doctor bandaged his hand up. I think the stuff that he poured on there is like an acid that eats your skin away. The sun was not up yet when Henry climbed into the box. Ready, he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. There's this picture right here. And then here's the picture again. You see where it's going to Philadelphia. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat that's headed to Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move because someone might hear him. He is upside down in this box. I'm tired of standing, someone said. Well, why don't we just move that box and sit on it? Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? See in the top how he's upside down? Now he's on his side. Now he's on his back. And look, when they finally get to where they want to sit, he's right side up. That's good. Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck, and now he was on his right side, and now he was on his left. And suddenly, he was right side up. Let me show you a picture first and then read the words. So, this is not Henry, this is one of the men. He's sitting on the box, and you can see there's Henry in the box, and there's the other dude sitting on the box. They have to sit away from each other, kind of with their backs, so there's room. What do you think is in here? Said the first man. Mail, I guess, said the other. I am mail, thought Henry, but not the kind they imagined. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car. This time, head up. He fell asleep to the rattling of the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to a loud knocking. Henry, are you all right in there? Time for a restroom break. That's what I did to get to school all the time. I get to a place where they were, that's all for today. Oh no, maybe I will read the rest. Nope, that's it. We'll do it later. Do you want to hear what happened? The last thing I read was, Henry, are you all right in there? All right, he answered. Look at that. I love it. All right. The cover was pried open. Henry was stretched. He wasn't stretched. He stretched on his own. He wasn't stretched. That's another story. Witch trials, but that's a whole other day. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. Welcome to Philadelphia. At last, Henry had a birthday. March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him, you want to have it? Henry Box Brown. And it did not bother him one bit. And that's the end of the book, but I want to tell you just a little bit more about it right here. It's called Henry's Freedom Box. In about the mid-1800s, there were around 4 million slaves living in the United States. And slaves were owned, you all heard, like a cow or a table or a wagon. And historians believe that between 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom traveling on what was called the Underground Railroad. We used to have a field trip to Cincinnati to the Underground Railroad Museum. And even after studying about all this and everything, we still have 1 or 2 kids that thought we were going to go up and get on a train and go underground. And I was, no. We were not doing that. So anyway, the And the thing to understand, like I told you at the beginning, Underground Railroad was not an underground railroad. It wasn't a real railroad. It was a secret way that slaves made their way from the south to the north. They hid in crates, they rode on horseback, they walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, they crossed flowing rivers in the summer and iceberg-covered, icebound rivers in the winter. One lady strapped her baby on her back, and she's another famous one, and I think is outside of Madison, and hopped across that frozen river from iceberg to iceberg with her baby on her back and made it to freedom because she was being chased by slave hunters. When Henry Brown climbed into that freedom box, he hoped he would be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool. A lot of kids, and not just kids, adults say, well, how did he breathe in there? He brought along a little small tool to make air holes, and a little water and a few biscuits. And Henry arrived in Philadelphia having traveled 350 miles from Richmond, Virginia, to Washington, or to Philadelphia, stopped at Washington, D.C., in 27 hours. So 27 hours he stayed in that box, most of the time upside down. His story made newspaper headlines in America and in Europe. He never found Nancy and his kids. It did not turn out like a fairy tale. In 1850, he went to England, and there's reports that he married again in England. We do know with absolute certainty that Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad. He was known as the man who mailed himself to freedom. And then, I'm going to start this song and finish up here. So when we went every year to and if you've never been, you need to go to Cincinnati to the Underground Railroad Museum. When it was built not that long ago, Oprah Winfrey donated eons of money to build it, and it's just amazing. But they have one section where it's a hands-on thing, where kids can put their hands on things and touch and all that stuff. And they have not the exact box that Henry went in, but they did the box to the exact dimensions of the box that Henry went in. And the kids can climb in it. And of course I have to stand there and take pictures of every kid that climbs in Henry's box. And then they want me to climb in. One time Carol and I climbed in together, and of course she could just fly right out of there, and the kids had to grab me by the arms and pull me out. But so if you want to try to, and we one time we had Jason Simpson get in there, and just we put the biggest people we could find in there just to show the kids how much room they had left in there. So if you want to follow the drinking gourd and follow the path that Henry Brown took, Cincinnati, you can climb in this box. Hey, thank you. I know it's longer than usual, but sometimes the history we gotta take a few minutes.
When the great big river meets the little river, follow the drinking gourd, for the old man's a waiting for to carry you to freedom.